I believe it is a massive achievement in cinema that Robert Eggers has brought us the first Dracula adaptation where the Count hangs dong.
Oh, hell no, man. What the f***, man?
That being said, personally, I'm more of an ass man.
God damn!
Now, you've seen the title, you know the premise, but before we proceed, I would like to say that I believe Nosferatu was a good movie. I really like Robert Eggers' work, so much so that I created a VHS slipcover for The Lighthouse 2019. I'm also happy to see that he's enjoying some much-deserved financial success after The Northman failed to perform at the box office. Unfortunately, my approval of this film means that any review I would make would be tedious ball washing, peppered with minor complaints already sufficiently covered by those who are able to get out a video in a timely fashion. So to make things more interesting, I'm going to be comparing Nosferatu 2024 to a film that I believe is better in almost every category. That film being Francis Ford Coppola's Bram Stoker's Dracula 1992. Now, I'm sure some of you are thinking, why compare these two movies? Wouldn't it make more sense to compare to an actual Nosferatu film like the original or the Werner Herzog remake? Well, I've got a few reasons. One, I don't know either of those movies particularly well. In both cases, I tried to watch the film in social settings, got a little too drunk, things didn't really sink in. Hell, I could probably tell you more about Shadow the Vampire 2000, which interestingly enough, features Willem Dafoe in the role of Nosferatu.
The script girl. I'll eat her later. No.
Reason number two is I think that both of these films would make for fairly lopsided comparison. It goes without saying both films are quite old at this point, and despite being iconic and influential in their own rights, and having many virtues that extend well beyond visual flair, both films feature budgetary and technological limitations that would make it difficult for them to go pound for pound with any competently made modern film. And I mean that only in holistic production technical terms. In contrast, despite being old enough to legitimately consider Turkish hair plugs, Dracula 1992 punches well above its weight. The film boasts a healthy budget when adjusted for inflation, a masterclass in visual effects, one of the best scores ever put to film, and a classic auteur director at the helm in Francis Ford Coppola. I'm telling you, this movie has aged shockingly well. Finally, despite the title, Nosferatu and Dracula are, in essence, the same movie. For the uninitiated, the original Nosferatu was an unlicensed adaptation of Bram Stoker's 1897 Gothic classic, Dracula. Names and minor details were changed to avoid copyright issues, however, foundationally, the story remains fairly consistent. This is, of course, also true of Eggers' 2024 adaptation. Count Orlok is Count Dracula, Thomas Hutter is Jonathan Harker, Elaine Hutter is Mina Harker, Von Franz is Von Helsing, Anna Harding is Lucy, Herr Knock is Renfield, the list goes on. It's also important to keep in mind that screenwriter James V. Hart took his own liberties with the source material, and, like Nosferatu, Bram Stoker's Dracula in 1992 isn't a strict retelling of the novel. Now, with all that out of the way, how do these two movies stack up? First, I'd like to get production out of the way, as, in my eyes, the winner is pretty apparent. While modern Disney seems to have mastered the art of turning $200 million into a steaming pile of shit, directors of Eggers and Coppola's caliber really know how to stretch a buck. And unfortunately, Coppola's $30 million advantage really shows. Personally, I don't put much stock in the Oscars. However, I do think it's worth mentioning that Bram Stoker's Dracula in 1992 took home 3 out of the 4 Academy Awards it was nominated for. This includes Best Costume Design, Best Makeup, and Best Sound Editing. The film is an absolute feast for the eyes, with every frame packed with beautiful costume work, props, and architecture. Additionally, Coppola insisted that all the effect sequences were achieved in camera, making use of rear projection, miniatures, matte paintings, and forced perspective. This film is completely absent even rudimentary digital techniques, like composites or green screens. Despite this, the film is absolutely packed with effects sequences that remain extremely impressive more than 30 years later. I would like to say that while Eggers certainly made use of digital effects, he avoided CGI wherever possible, making use of live rats on set, and even using potato flakes instead of the digital snow, which has now become industry standard. In general, Eggers seemed to have been shooting for a totally different style than Dracula, with a higher emphasis on realism. As a result, the costumes and sets feel massively toned down in comparison. The color palette is very muted and toned down, obviously paying homage to Nosferatu's roots as a black and white film. Unfortunately, for me, the film feels a bit too stripped down and too dark. And I mean that literally. I could barely tell what was going on in Count Orlok's castle. In a sense, this could be considered immersive in that, as a viewer, you are sharing Thomas's sense of confusion and discomfort. That being said, I am not a fan of this approach stylistically. When I'm watching a movie on the big screen, I don't want 50% of the frame obscured in darkness this often. In many ways, this approach lessens the impact of the horror sequences. If everything is dark, then nothing is dark. Personally, I need some degree of brightness, levity, and color to juxtapose with and bring emphasis to the more frightening scenes. There are times when Egger's more stripped-down approach can feel pleasantly intimate, but at others it feels a little claustrophobic and low stakes. Other than Orlok's member, I can't think of anything in the 1992 version that doesn't feel bigger. Dracula's castle feels bigger, Lucy's home feels bigger, the sanitarium, the streets of London, the hedge maze, it's all bigger. This concept could not be illustrated more clearly than in the introduction of our Van Helsing/von Franz character. In the case of Helsing, we see him giving a lecture in an operating theater, commanding the attention of tens of full costumed extras who look down intently. In contrast, we meet von Franz in a small, dimly lit dwelling, packed floor to ceiling with books, vague scientific equipment, and bric-a-brac. I also think this says a lot about how these two characters differ between the two adaptations. However, that's something I'll be discussing in more detail later in the review. To close out this section, I'd like to briefly touch on both films' score. As I stated earlier, I'm of the opinion that Dracula in 1992 features some of the best music put to film. Wojciech Kilar's compositions do a lot of heavy lifting, with strong string sections, percussion, horns, and eerie choral melodies. It fits the story so well that at times it can feel like an unseen character, contributing immense gravity and emotion to every scene. Nosferatu's score is certainly serviceable, but I found it to be overly ambient, with few discernible motifs. It just doesn't do a whole lot for the movie and certainly isn't memorable. And even stronger tracks like Premonitions kind of feel like temp score for Dracula's stronger pieces like Mina's Dream or Love Remembered. And all this isn't to say that a bigger budget automatically makes for a better film. The Lighthouse was made on a paltry $11 million and looks amazing. I simply think that Coppola's visual approach and more robust budget resulted in something that felt like a more grand and fleshed out world. Honestly, this section would be a total blowout if it weren't for Keanu's fake gray hair in 1992. I don't know what happened here, but the makeup department definitely dropped the ball and we ended up with some anime convention type shit. Now, this next section is interesting because it features Bram Stoker's Dracula's weakest element, the albatross around its neck that has likely prevented the film from achieving the status of classic. That is, of course, Keanu Reeves' performance. I know this may come as a shocker to some people, but Keanu is in fact not British, and his accent is a little rough.
I've seen many strange things already. Bloody wolves chasing me through some blue inferno.
He is basically the Jar Jar Binks of this film. This performance feels particularly cringe and out of place when juxtaposed with Oscar award-winning European actors like Anthony Hopkins and Gary Oldman. Personally, I find the performance to be very hilarious on a so bad it's good level. It's honestly kind of endearing and very fun to laugh at. However, I can see how every scene that features him is immersion breaking for most people. In fairness to Coppola, this casting was the result of studio meddling. In order to secure funding, he needed to cast an up-and-coming American actor who would hopefully boost ticket sales. 3 actors, all of which I think would have been a better choice, were considered. That being Johnny Depp, Charlie Sheen, and Christian Slater. But for better, or definitely worse, we ended up with Keanu. This is obviously a pretty big point in Nosferatu's favor. Nicholas Hoult does an infinitely better job in the role of Thomas Hutter and has a lot more bearing on the plot. I will say that in general, I'm not a big fan of either Jonathan or Thomas. They're both just kind of lame, twinky Victorian husbands who are just way in over their head. Coming back to Dracula, you might think Winona was another American actor simply cast for their box office draw. However, it was actually Winona who brought Dracula's script to Coppola's attention. The two had a prior working relationship, as Winona was originally cast to play Mary in The Godfather Part 3, but was forced to drop out last minute, resulting in the unfortunate casting of Francis's daughter. While both Winona Ryder and Lily Rose Depp's British accent could use a little work, I personally find Mina Harker to be a far more compelling character. For whatever reason, Eggers chose to roll Bram Stoker's Mina Harker and Lucy Westenra together to create Elaine Hutter. Unfortunately, I believe this amalgamation makes for a fairly difficult character to resonate with and anchor a plot to. In both the original novel and the 1992 adaptation, Lucy is Dracula's first victim. She is driven to madness and eventually death via his nightly feedings. As a combination of these two characters, Elaine Hutter must strike the very delicate balance of embodying both the demonically possessed damsel that is Lucy and the highly autonomous protagonist that is Mina. While we, the audience, understand that Elaine's eccentric behavior is the result of her high spiritual acuity and psychic connection to Count Orlok, it can be difficult to relate to a character who spends half the movie having seizures in bed and the other half raving like an irrational weirdo. I'm just saying I can understand it when other characters get a little annoyed with Elaine. Mina, on the other hand, feels a lot more relatable. She's seduced by Dracula because he's f***ing sexy. He can turn teardrops into diamonds, instantly tame bloodthirsty wolves. He's cultured, bilingual, poetic, and emotionally deep. Plus, it's revealed that they share a psychic connection because Mina is the reincarnation of Dracula's long-dead wife. I can understand why Mina and Dracula are drawn to one another. It also probably helps that she doesn't know he's actively trying to kill her husband. In the case of Elaine, I don't really get it. She was really lonely and horny as a kid, and that somehow summoned a really gross Romanian noble? What? Why? I also think that the amount of roles that Elaine needs to fulfill in the story puts a pretty heavy strain on Lily Rose Depp as an actress, and the effectiveness of her performance is going to vary from person to person. For instance, I've seen a few articles reporting audience members laughing during the scene where Elaine is convulsing. I wasn't aware of this until I saw Red Letter Media's review, in which Jay delivers this absolutely brain-dead take.
I read something, I tried to avoid too much about the movie going into it because I wanted to go in fresh, because I like Robert Eggers. But I read a little bit of like people laughing in the theater every time Lily Rose Depp had like a convulsion, which is like the most horrifying thing ever.
Yeah.
But she's making funny faces, so people in the theater laughed. So it's like that, or it's like, why do you even go to a movie?
I'm sorry, but a movie doesn't deserve silence and reverence simply by virtue of being a movie. If an audience thinks a performance is laughable, they're free to laugh. It's literally an involuntary response. I do it all the time. You'd think the people that brought us over 150 episodes of Best the Worst, a series built on laughing at movies, would understand this. I'm honestly beginning to think these guys might be getting a little too old for the theater experience. Apparently their showing only had 4 attendees. Mind you, this is an insane luxury. My showing was absolutely packed. But still, they were able to devote 4 minutes of their review to a guy eating popcorn at a theater. Just stop going. In regards to the sequence in question, while I personally enjoyed this portion of the film, I think this kind of convulsing full-body performance was pulled off much better in Possession 1981. Isabella Jondi's performance didn't need audience's reverence. It commanded it. Moving on to our vampires, Count Dracula is much more defined as a character than Orlok. In the 1992 adaptation, Dracula is literally real-world historical figure Vlad the Impaler. When his wife is driven to suicide by the deception of his enemies, he denounces God and is cursed to walk the world eternal as a vampire. Sure, he's a terrible monster and a massive threat to society, but he's also a tortured soul who wants nothing more than to be reunited with the love of his life. In the case of Orlok, I'm not really sure I understand his MO. He's like some zombie groomer who was brought back to life because some British child learned to masturbate. That's definitely really scary, but I don't know if it's as narratively compelling as the backstory we're provided with Dracula. I also think that it's interesting that despite all the information we're given, Dracula feels more mysterious. And to touch on casting, maybe this is a hot take, but I'm not really sure why I should give a f about Bill Skarsgård. You're telling me a guy this attractive has only found success in roles where he's wearing 2 pounds of prosthetic makeup, and that's not raising any red flags about his acting prowess? And I'm sorry to all the horror fans who are trying to push Pennywise as a horror icon, but It 2017 sucked. It was just more 80s nostalgia bait / Stranger Things DLC content. I mean, I could barely understand Bill through those prosthetic teeth. Gary Oldman is a far superior actor, and I refuse to believe that Bill Skarsgård is the next Andy Serkis simply because he's another guy willing to do roles where no one gets to see his face. Now, there are a lot more characters we could compare and contrast. However, I think I'd like to close out this section by discussing what is possibly the second most iconic character to be birthed from the mind of Bram Stoker. That being the prototypical vampire slayer Van Helsing, and in the case of Nosferatu, Von Franz. This part is a bit difficult for me because I really love Willem Dafoe. I'm loving this career renaissance he's going through currently and think he did an amazing job in this film. However, through no fault of his own, I have a pretty strong preference for Anthony Hopkins' take on Von Helsing. Functionally, they're not too dissimilar, both being professors uniquely qualified to fight vampires thanks to their knowledge of the occult. However, they do differ as characters in a few ways. Den of Geeks' Joe George, a man with 2 first names, wrote an interesting article praising Egger's decision to depict Franz as a more tender humanitarian. He certainly gets you on his side right away, with his kind treatment and advocacy for Elaine. He definitely has the eccentric willfulness of Van Helsing, but he also embodies the softness of an understanding therapist. In contrast, Hopkins' Van Helsing has this devilish charm and eccentric playful energy. While as a doctor, he certainly cares for his patients, I don't know that I'd call him particularly tender. If anything, Hopkins brings this commanding, dangerous aura. Despite his more advanced age, he's extremely virile, and you get the feeling that he could easily overcome a younger opponent in a violent altercation. In his dealings with Dracula and the various other vampires in the film, he is on the attack, and he is very much a real threat. In a lot of ways, Von Franz feels a little limp in comparison. I really can't overstate the amount of charisma Hopkins brings to this role. Dude is pushing 60 and he still manages to be sexy. By the way, I definitely couldn't justify a section about this, but it needs to be said. In general, Bram Stoker's Dracula is a sexier movie. Mina is sexy. Lucy is sexy. Lucy's suitors, not this guy, also sexy. Van Helsing is sexy. Dracula is sexy. Dracula's wives are sexy. It's all sexy. Now, this may sound like some weird omission of my status as a gooner, but traditionally vampire films have featured some element of sex appeal. Vampires are very frightening but alluring creatures, not only because they often seduce their victims, but because their immortality and everlasting youth can tempt humans into abandoning their souls to join their ranks. Feel free to disagree, but I think this is something that makes them very interesting and dangerous. If you take away this element and the themes associated with it, they're basically just overpowered intelligent zombies. This is, of course, my roundabout, pseudo-intellectual way of saying that I wish this movie about f***ing a dead guy was a little more sexy. This section isn't going to be extremely robust because the story of both films is quite good. They obviously both benefit from a great source material. There is definitely a reason we've been telling the story for over 100 years now. Now, I think there are a few places where Eggers chose to deviate from the source material that really worked in his favor. I think it was particularly smart to give Herr Knock a more active role in the plot. Compared to Dracula's Renfield, Knock is a far more lucid and useful collaborator to Count Orlok. Listen, I love Tom Waits as much as the next guy, and I think he did a great job as Renfield, but he kind of just sits around eating bugs and being weird. He certainly contributes to the foreboding tone of the film, but if his scenes were removed completely, it honestly wouldn't have much effect on the narrative. Where I do have a pretty strong preference for Bram Stoker's Dracula is in the ending. In keeping with Nosferatu 1922, Elaine Hutter must sacrifice herself in order to save Weisberg from the plague brought on by Count Orlok. By offering her body and blood to him willingly, she is able to distract him until daybreak. The distraction works and Orlok is killed, but unfortunately Elaine dies in the process. This ending is of course tragic, but there's also a profound beauty in Elaine's selflessness and the fact that such a grand sacrifice could take place in the modest setting of a small Victorian bedroom. In contrast, Dracula 1992's ending is a climax of epic proportions. After Van Helsing and the gang are able to destroy Carfax Abbey and much of Dracula's supply of ancestral dirt, the vampire is forced to flee back to Transylvania with the help of his gypsy guard. This results in the slaying of Dracula's wives, an epic chase and gun battle through the Carpathian Mountains, and the unfortunate death of American hottie Quincy Morris. It's very exciting and high stakes. The tension is only enhanced by the ticking clock element of nightfall fast approaching. Dracula is wounded in the battle, and then in the chapel where he renounced God hundreds of years previously, he shares one last smooch with Mina, who then stabs him through the heart and chops off his head. Then we see via a fresco painting that his soul has ascended to heaven, and he's finally reunited with his long-dead wife, Elisabetta. This is a little weird considering it's pretty heavily implied that the soul of Elisabetta should currently be inhabiting Mina's body, but whatever. It's a beautiful ending regardless of how the mechanics of reincarnation may or may not work. I think that both of these endings function very well in different ways. I certainly don't think every film needs a bombastic, blockbuster climax to be effective. However, I do appreciate Coppola's more epic approach to capping off the story. I also like that it is a rather touching culmination of screenwriter James V. Hart's attempts to depict Dracula more explicitly as a tragic figure. I'd like to close out by saying that while I personally find it very fun to pit these movies against one another for the sake of online discussion, at the end of the day, they're both great movies, and the result of very different creative minds. I do have a strong preference for Coppola's take on the source material, however, I think Nosferatu was a triumph, and I'm very excited to see what this box office success means for Robert Eggers' career down the line.